experience a couple of years ago. I was in England speaking at a preaching conference, and 5 different ministers, or 5 or 6 different ministers, talked to me about the persecution they were experiencing in their ministry. And separately. So, of course, I talked to them to make sure that it wasn't self-induced persecution. I was amused to hear recently that John Newton used to name parishioners when he was Vicar of Olney and to talk about their sins publicly, which I would think was probably an unwise thing to do. And perhaps some of the suffering he endured might have been his own fault. Anyway, I found myself saying the same thing to each one of them, which was that when Job was suffering, the point was whether Job believed in God or not. God believed in Job, and in fact, God had been boasting about Job's endurance. So the persecution, if you like, that Job suffered, the pressure from Satan, was allowed by God not to break Job, but to demonstrate his endurance under suffering. So I said to each of them, you may find it hard to trust God in the midst of this persecution, but God trusts you. He's entrusted you with it, and he trusts that you will endure it, and it will be for your benefit and for your blessing and for the blessing of others. I didn't know how I'd respond if somebody said that to me, but I felt it ought to be, helpful to them anyway. Yeah. Because I think we in the West have such a negative view of suffering. It must always be a dreadful thing, and God must have lost the plot if we suffer. But actually the Bible is quite positive about suffering. And there are lots of New Testament references in the Hebrews and 1 Peter and James and so on about the educative effects of suffering. But more than that, I think, it's a sign that God trusts someone.
I remember when I was a university student hearing a convicting talk by the chaplain about how the Moravian Brethren sought to reach into leper colonies. And I think it's in a Robert Murray McShane letter, he speaks of Moravian Brethren who would go into a leper colony to reach the people for Christ, but they'd do that knowing they'd never come out. Once you'd contracted that disease, you needed to be kept separate from everybody else. And the challenge to myself and to other students at the time was, what steps, what lengths would you take to serve God? Would you be prepared to do that? And I think if the circumstances were expressed differently, if it was put something like, how far would you go? Would you accept a terminal cancer diagnosis to reach people with terminal cancer? I'd be thinking, I'm sure there's somebody out there, God, who would be willing to do that. But I don't think it's me. And that, for me, has been what God has planned. I'm sure there's a lot more to being diagnosed with a terminal disease than simply reaching others in that situation. But having had my own plans blown out of the water, God has demonstrated a whole world of people that he cares for, people that are suffering, people who have no earthly hope, who need to hear of eternal hope. And I do count it a privilege to be able to speak as an insider into their world, into their circumstances, and to encourage them to see that there's a bigger hope than a cure for cancer, that one day, even if they're healed of their disease, and I do honestly pray and hope that diseases like this will be mastered, there'll be yet another reason for our own death, because mortality is something that we all face and yet rarely acknowledge. And so for me, being diagnosed with cancer has opened a world of opportunity. It's also reminded me of my own mortality, my frailty, and it's been a very significant opportunity for me to ask those real-life existential questions about whether what I believed, studied, taught, preached stands up in the face of my own circumstances. And painful, but very positive. And I often come back to those verses at the beginning of 2 Corinthians 1 where the God of all comfort brings Paul to the point of death, that he might not trust in himself but in the God who works through him and strengthens him, and that circumstance, that whatever it is that Paul's been going through, might be a very substantial basis of faith and ministry to others. And I pray that God will help me to do that. And I pray that God will maintain my faith in the midst of whatever difficulties, suffering, and ultimately my own death to come.